What a great song. Welcome back to our final panel of the day. Once again, I'm Monique Alcala. I'm the Chief of Staff for Now, and I'll be moderating this panel on one of my favorite topics, which is rebuilding democracy. Democratic systems of government are essential in the protection of human rights. However, we know that the strengths of democracies all over the world have been tested and pushed to the limits. We know that when governments falter, communities of color, LGBTQIA+ individuals, women, and immigrants are the most vulnerable and the first to suffer. With the new administration in the White House, the calls to return to a pre-Trump normal fall woefully short of the pressing need to rebuild a democracy that works for those who have been long marginalized. During this panel, we're going to discuss the ways to reframe our discourse to ensure that the voices of marginalized communities are amplified and elevated in our discussion of rebuilding democracy. In addition, we will also discuss why it is critically important that we listen to these voices both in the US and around the world. First, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Koa Beck, author of White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind. Koa is the former editor-in-chief of Jezebel and former executive editor at Vogue. She is the co-author or co-host of the hashtag #MeToo memos on WNYC's The Takeaway, and her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Observer, The Guardian, and Esquire, among others. Welcome, Koa.
Hi, my name is Koa Beck, and I am the author of White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind. I'm looking forward to explaining to you not just the origins of white feminism within feminist organizing, but also the responsibility to combat this ideology in the same way that I hope you would racism, heterosexism, ableism, many other oppressive structures. White feminism inherits a lot from these ideologies and unfortunately ingratiates itself in feminist practices and in feminist spaces. The origins of white feminism as an ideology, as a practice in this country, originate around the time of the modern suffrage movement. At least that's where I trace it. And to be clear, when I say white feminism, I define it as a very specific approach towards achieving gender equality that inherits considerably from colonialism, imperialism, some key pieces of white supremacy, and labor exploitation. And one of its signatures, among many, is this individual accumulation of wealth and autonomy as being the benchmark of collective feminist progress. So in the United States specifically, white feminism's origins are, as I said, with the modern suffrage movement. At that time, a lot of women in this country were organizing for the vote. And by that, I mean through, middle to upper class white women, through Native women, through Black women in this country, along with many other groups. But a number of mainstream suffrage organizations decided that the way they would really push public support for women having the vote was to really export a very visual concept of who this woman was, who wanted the vote and who deserved it. And they achieved this through partnering with consumerism to tell us who the woman in women's rights was. When I was doing archival research for my book, it was very apparent that this image of suffrage was not only created in-house, but exported everywhere. And this is very apparent in a number of historical records that exist from that time period. The woman who you were supposed to be advocating for, she was very thin, she was able-bodied, she was white, she was heterosexual, she aspired to be a mother and a wife. She was middle class or, aspired to be, and that's who you were supposed to think of. And I find even now, through what some people deem fourth wave white feminism, this idea still exists of homogenizing either what feminist experiences are or who the women and non-binary people look like, who you're supposed to think of, even what their contributions should be. A facet I go into in my book is that I feel like white feminism as a practice and as an ideology has really evolved to usurp a lot of corporate labor, in that white feminists of now may not necessarily all be white or middle class or straight, but they are all happily working in offices, and they are checking lots of email, and they are being very organized, and they aspire to initiate, complete much corporate labor. I think the way back from white feminism, especially when we look at many movements in this country that have fought for gender rights that are not based on a white feminist ideology or practice, is starting at basic need. Many women, as I'm sure you all know, and non-binary people come to this movement in search of a basic standard of living. They're not necessarily looking to be corporate leaders. They're looking for food security. They're looking for affordable housing, clean water, healthcare access, along with a number of other ventures. So I think a good way to curtail that, and also the nefarious nature of white feminism in organizing, is to constantly return to this place of basic need, as well as to ensure that you think collectively and not just come to feminism with a very individualized narrative, but an understanding that all of us do have rights, and that is an effort to make sure that our governmental bodies respect that, and not ask that we aspire to be something else to be seen by feminism.
Thank you so much for being here today, Koa. Your remarks are a perfect foundation for our panel, who I'd now like to introduce. First, we have Dr. Keith Robinson, who serves as a founding partner of Clarin Data. He has a background as a quantitative researcher and faculty member at the University of Texas, Austin. He published extensively on achievement differences in K-12 schooling in the US and co-authored The Broken Compass, Parental Involvement in Children's Education, which was the largest study ever conducted on the effects of parents' involvement in education. He has also consulted for the U.S. Department of Education and some of the largest philanthropic organizations in the country. Welcome, Keith.
Good to be here.
And next we have Julian Brave Noisecat. Julian is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy for Data for Progress and is the Narrative Change Director for the Natural History Museum. He is a columnist for Canada's National Observer, contributing editor for Canadian Geographic, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and other publications. His work is supported with fellowships from the Type Media Foundation, NDN Collective, and the Center for Humans and Nature. Julian is a proud member of the Kanem Lake Band Cheskan and descendant of the Liwat Nation of Mount Curry.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great.
Sorry, that was a long bio.
You're fine. And we also have with us today Aditi Junja. Aditi is Counsel with Protect Democracy, where she helped to lead their work on felon re-enfranchisement, clemency reform, and ensuring we had a free and fair election in 2020. Thank you, Aditi. Before joining Protect Democracy, Aditi co-founded and led the Resistance Manual and ourstates.org. She was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy in 2018 for that work. Welcome, Aditi. And thank you all for being here today. I'm going to start this conversation, a very important conversation, with Julian. Julian, you've been at the center of one of the most contentious policy debates in recent history, climate change and the Green New Deal. And we know that climate change disproportionately affects communities of color, but we also know that a lot of the policymaking around this issue, and pretty much every issue, has historically been done by people who are not directly impacted by the legislation being created. I think we can all identify who those people are. Can you discuss with us why it's important to have directly impacted communities at the table in policymaking, and talk about the intersection of this with social movements and what role this plays in shaping and rebuilding democracy?
Absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you so much for the question, Monique, and thank you to Now for inviting me to speak on this panel. Obviously, it's an incredibly esteemed organization in the history of social justice, gender justice in our country, and it's obviously an honor to get the opportunity to speak alongside some very brilliant people. To respond to the question, I would say that we are actually right now today getting a really powerful sort of moment that is illustrating the importance of bringing new voices, excluded voices to the policymaking table. And we're getting that through the Senate confirmation hearings of Congresswoman Deb Haaland, a citizen of the Laguna Pueblo, who, if confirmed, would become the first Native American cabinet secretary in United States history. I'm sure many folks know this, but Congresswoman Haaland has actually already had a historic career, and alongside Representative Sharice Davids of Kansas, she became one of the two first Native American women elected to Congress in 2018. Now, the Secretary of Interior's role is an incredibly important policy-making role. The Interior Department has a broad purview over public lands, the nation's natural resources, as well as Indian affairs. And for Native people, those lands and resources are ones that were taken from us. And of course, our affairs are ones where we've never sat across the table from another Native person. And in fact, that history has been immensely damaging to tribal nations. Former Secretary of Interior Alexander Stewart described Interior's mission as, quote, to civilize or exterminate Native people. Now, yesterday, when Congresswoman Haaland introduced herself to the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, she first spoke in her indigenous language, the Keres language. She acknowledged that the hearing was taking place on Piscataway territory in what is now Washington, D.C. And of course, she also carried into that meeting a lifetime of experiences as a Native woman, the experience of visiting a grandmother who lived without running water and electricity, the experience of working traditional cornfields, of cooking for Pueblo feast days, and also traveling to the camps erected in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016, and making green chili stew and tortillas for water protectors. And of course, in the history of the United States, we've never had any of those experiences at the helm of the department that manages lands and resources taken from Native nations, as well as the policy portfolio that pertains to tribes. And I think that in that juxtaposition of an agency that was designed in much of its history to annihilate Native people, and now the first Native woman ever in the cabinet actually being nominated for that position, I think we have an incredibly powerful illustration of why representation and power and a seat at the table really matters. And I think I like many other people across Indian country are watching this confirmation hearing on the edge of our seats and incredibly hopeful that the right thing will happen and the Senate will confirm her for this really important position.
That's fantastic. I've been on the edge of my seat also watching all of these confirmations. So thank you so much. So we want to transition over to Dr. Keith Robinson now. We know it's important, and but based on what Julian just talked about why it's important to have communities who have been directly impacted by policy included in our discourse, and that have really pushed the narrative on what is possible to achieve. However, we know that racialized policies impact people starting from birth, and longitudinal studies illustrate that access to things like quality education are strongly associated with opportunity in this country. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in your research and contextualize the inequitable distribution of resources, why that exists, and what are the implications for a rapidly diversifying country?
Yeah, so it's great to be on, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. So one of the things that gets lost on people is that America does not educate its school children the same. So I run an educational consulting company that does work in the K-12 space throughout the country. And I quite regularly witness disparities in education resources firsthand. Students in higher income areas often have access to personal laptops, Google teaching boards in the classroom, tutors, gifted and talented programs, arts classes, smaller class sizes, and guidance counselors. And importantly, under COVID, school psychologists. In lower income areas, you rarely see any of these. Lower income students are more likely to be taught by lower paid teachers, educated in more crowded classrooms, taught in more dilapidated buildings, and more frequently taught by substitute teachers. But if you look at America, this situation has been going on for decades, and some would even say centuries. And the reason is that structural advantage and disadvantage is rooted in how America has set up its K-12 system, whereby public school districts are run by local cities and towns and funded by local property taxes. So education ends up being funded by the amount of money available in a school district. The federal government does kick in roughly 10% of school budgets nationally, but America has a terrible history of government-led housing discrimination in the form of redlining, deed restrictions, and racial covenants, which has made our neighborhoods look the way they do racially and socioeconomically. And so as a result, the quality of education kids receive varies widely. And this system of funding schools that we have adopted in this country inevitably creates winners and educational winners and losers. The losers are overwhelmingly brown and Black kids and poor and low income kids. Nationally, their school districts spend about 15% less per student than wealthier districts. And so, unfortunately, the effects of our unequal education system are perpetual. So they continue to produce disadvantages throughout students' lives in the form of completed education, quality of education received, lifetime wealth and wages, and so forth. And so, we know that our country is rapidly diversifying. And so the question and the challenge is, how do we better educate our school children in ways that facilitate their incorporation into a democratic society? And, there are a number of things to point out here, but in the interest of time, I think one that is critically important is that we change the ways in which we teach history. For so long, Eurocentrism in history and social studies has been the norm. Our history curriculum needs much more diversity, whereby the roles of non-Europeans are not secondary, and students get a much more developed historical knowledge of the world that's not centered solely on Western or largely on Western priorities.
That's great. Thank you so much. Sorry. So thank you, Dr. Robinson, for speaking on the barriers and the structural inequality. But we do want to zoom out quite a bit. We had a very important election that we just had in 2020, very high stakes. And we want to talk a little bit about in the future, when people are able to participate to vote, like what are some of the direct attacks on these historically underrepresented communities and voting rights? So my next question is for Aditi. So Aditi, can you discuss your work during probably one of the most high stakes elections in modern history, in the 2020 election? And in particular, what were some of the obstacles you faced, and what tactics did you find successful to ensure that communities could fully participate and have their voice heard in this democratic process?
That's a good question. We formed the National Task Force on Election Crises in February of 2019. So we were preparing for this election for almost 2 years before it happened. And we thought through a number of different crises that could happen. But the reason to have the task force in the first place was an understanding that the outcome of the election was likely to be attacked and undermined, and that attack was likely to be sustained, and it was likely to come from the president of the United States at the time, President Trump. And so there was a lot of work to do to try to inoculate against that type of messaging. And obviously a major reason that the election outcome, particularly if it had been closer, was going to be called into question was tied to race, to whether the rights of Black and Brown people are realized in this country, and whether my right to vote is the same as a white person's right to vote, and whether I am considered a true member of the polity. And that is really the attack that we were kind of preparing to combat for those 2 years. How it ended up playing out was because of COVID, things got thrown into chaos much sooner, and the task force became public sooner than we had planned. So in April of 2020, the task force became public, and we put out guidance on how to conduct elections during the time of COVID. And this created a lot of challenges during the primaries, which I'm sure many people here experienced, where rules were being changed daily. So whether you could vote absentee or not was being changed like on an ongoing basis. And it made it really challenging for those who are doing GOTV, trying to inform people about how to vote, when the ways you could vote were being changed constantly, not just through legislation, but then being challenged in the courts, decisions upheld, decisions overturned, back and forth, back and forth. That created a lot of confusion. And then in the lead up to the general election, one of the kind of broad challenges we saw through the summer, we became increasingly worried about like the presence of federal law enforcement and the deployment of troops, and the ways that the president might try to use that as a way to try to suppress voter turnout. We didn't see that as much in the general election, but what we did see was voter intimidation, white supremacist threats, white supremacist organizing. And the real challenge and the lesson we'd learned from the 2016 election is calling attention to these issues actually further suppresses voter turnout. So if you raise up the issue to the public that there was voter intimidation in this town in Texas, people in Texas are less likely to vote. People become scared to go to the polls, people become nervous. And so it became this real catch-22 for organizations who care about voting rights and voter intimidation to try to combat it without making it public. And so there were coalitions of voting rights organizations basically decided that their hotlines, 866 Protect Our Vote, other ways to report to Lawyers Committee and other organizations about challenges and threats you're seeing to the right to vote. And lawyers on the ground were deployed and trying to combat that and push back against it. But there was not the benefit of media attention, and that was on purpose because there was fear that seeing those types of incidents well documented would actually suppress voter turnout. So I think that was some of the real challenge and landscape we were dealing with. And then in the post-election context, as everyone here experienced and knows, took days for results to be called. And then when they were called, there were celebrations planned. Those celebrations had actually been like planned weeks and months in advance. It was very fortuitous timing that it happened right at the moment when the election was finally called. But a real challenge with all of the real corrosive rhetoric that Trump was putting out around having won, premature claims of victory, undermining, challenging results, was that the tool of mobilizing and of protest was there was a real challenge about whether to use that, whether coalitions should mobilize and whether people should protest, largely because there was also reporting and tracking we were seeing of the likelihood of white supremacist violence in response to those protests, and the ways that those could be used as a tool to sort of feed Trump's narrative. And there was a real concern about safety for protesters. And so I think that a lot of the tools sort of became limited, whether it was media attention or public protest, for fear of racist violence. And then obviously, January 6th happened. We all witnessed this insurrection, which is just like white supremacy at its finest, which all of us, I'm sure, remember the summer and the way the Capitol Police were prepared for protesters around Movement for Black Lives, but somehow seemed unprepared for white supremacist attack on the Capitol, woefully unprepared. And obviously that raises questions about the security, who comprises the Capitol Police, and also raises, which I think is like not a new question, but put really in front of the entire country, why we don't take white supremacist violence seriously and threats of white supremacist violence seriously, particularly given how we respond to peaceful protest by marginalized communities. So I think that's sort of the broad landscape around what this election looked like, particularly the challenges for around voting rights and participation in the election. And obviously January 6th was an attempt to prevent votes from being counted, right? The Electoral College votes from being counted. And I think it really comes back to a core question of our polity since our founding, which is who is an American who has the right to exercise their vote.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? And obviously for all of the things that Keith and Julian talked about, like we have to vote, we have to be able to participate, we have to be able to make our voices heard in order to create changes, whether it's in education policy or other types of policy. And if we don't consider certain people parts of our polity and we don't care about them, we don't fund their education, we don't make sure they have access and right to their land and to their water. And so, you know, these questions are all deeply interconnected and tied together.
Thank you so much. Before I move into our question for all of the panelists, I wanted to make sure that I invited everybody to, because we are going to have a Q&A section, or we do have time for that. So if you want to add your questions into the chat, our team will make sure that we get those. But back to the panelists, you know, our speaker Koa Beck had discussed earlier how white supremacy and specifically white feminist ideology has negatively impacted Black and brown women and the progress that has been made on women's rights. So white supremacy is, and from what we can see, will continue to be something that communities have to battle in order to create a democracy that works for those who have been left behind. So we know that Trump, he definitely didn't create racism, and racist policies, as Keith had mentioned, are something that have been, and Julian and Aditi have mentioned that have been affecting communities of color for centuries. So on January 6th, it was a particularly dark moment for our country, and we saw firsthand how powerful this ideology can be. So can you share with us some thoughts, each of you, on where you feel we stand, where we are as a country, and what do you think that we need to do in order to rebuild our democracy and one that works for those who've been on the margins? Anybody can go.
I'll start and just say that I think the framing of the question is always an important one, because I don't know if we're rebuilding a democracy or we're building it for the first time. I don't know like when we ever had a true multiracial, equitable democracy in this country. And we certainly don't have a ton of models to look to throughout the world when you think about pluralistic societies where you don't have a majority of one ethnicity or one race. And I think that creates real challenges. And I think that the decline in interest in democracy is documented worldwide. Like the rise of authoritarian leaders is happening globally, and the rise of interest in populism is also happening globally. And so there are trends in our culture and in our information ecosystems that I think we need to take a close look at to really understand why that is happening. And from my perspective, one hypothesis I would put out is that it's about the responsiveness of government to people's material needs. And I think we saw that in real stark relief through our last year of COVID, and we'll continue to see it. But I think that, one way to kind of constantly be thinking about this problem, when I've been in conversations like these, are often focused on the symptoms. Like, we need to regulate social media. We need to figure out how the Electoral College. And fundamentally for me, it's about the people, right? So you have Fox News, and people leave Fox News to go to OAN because they want specific type of content. If Fox News was putting out content and there was no audience for it, they would stop putting it out. If politicians were running on fear and hate and losing, they would stop running on it. And so I think we have a real kind of cultural problem, and that, as you sort of think about, but why, that's the root of it. And I think, as Keith mentioned, we live in very segregated communities. People have real fear of one another and a real scarcity mindset. And I think getting at that, so that someone else's win is not your loss. So your kid getting educated doesn't mean my kid isn't. What does that mean for our democracy and how we move forward?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Aditi raised some terrific points. I have a lot to say about this, but I'll keep it in the time frame. So I think citizens remain far too vulnerable to being manipulated, whether it's voting or Cambridge Analytica or COVID. One of the reasons Trump was so effective for 4 years is because people were vulnerable to lies and manipulation. I don't think people have really internalized protecting themselves from being vulnerable in those ways as one of their most important civic duties. Another point is, I think, that Aditi raises that we should be understanding, I think, at this point now, that democracy is a work in progress. You have to always be working on it. It's not something that is sort of, you put it in the oven and then it's done, and then you don't have to look at it. And so we all have these civic responsibilities that I think for in some cases have been neglected for too long. I think we have to get away, I'll try to just hit on certain points. I think we have to get away from this very toxic zero-sum mentality, where, you know, if you win, I lose. And, you know, I think this toxic mentality has led to this phenomenon where efforts towards equality in our society, or efforts towards democracy, seem to be radical notions, and in particular threats to some people. And I think that is, I think that's really, in the past 4 years, we've really seen that happen. America is an idea, right? We have to work to make it a reality. And I think part of the fabric, part of the American fabric, is this notion of individualism. Yet I think many of the goals that we aspire to as a country rely on the collective. But I think we need to be much better at thinking about the collective. For example, there needs to be far less voting every 4 years on single item issues that just affect you or your way of life. There also needs to be an acceptance on the part of, I'm speaking about what we need to do as Americans. There needs to be an acceptance. There's still this pushback on accepting who we are as a country. We have some serious flaws, some historic, some contemporary, that are in urgent need of addressing. But I think we first have to be honest with ourselves and stop resisting the reflection of who we are that's being shown to us. Case in point, the January 6th riots. We've coddled white supremacy far too long in this country, and we need to be able to say that explicitly and accept this reality. Policing, we have to fix this. Right now, people of color tend to be under-policed in terms of response times and assistance, but over-policed for small infractions. People need to be policed in equitable ways, and for democracy to exist, people need to be able to voice their mistreatment, be heard by citizens who are not experiencing the same mistreatment, and have their mistreatment recognized by the justice system. Additionally, the cultures of police departments need to change. Far too often, admitting that citizens have been mistreated is viewed as a threat to police departments. And it also remains far too difficult to obtain data from police departments. This lack of transparency is another cultural element of policing that needs to change for democracy to thrive. So I have other thoughts, but I'll end on that.
I guess I'll close us out. Firstly, I'll just say that I very much appreciate and agree with what Dr. Robinson, Aditi, and Koa all said. I think I just want to make 3 points that I'll try to make briefly so we can get into the Q&A. So the first is that, you know, as a journalist and as a writer, my perception of our media and social media is that we have a crisis of listening in our society, by which I mean that we do a lot of talking now. We do a ton of, you know, people speaking their mind on social media. You know, we have cable news networks that have taken to an increasingly opinion-oriented form of media, where it's just normal course now for an anchor to, you know, launch into a 10-minute diatribe on Fox News, and that is considered journalism still. We also, of course, have a crisis of local news, wherein there just aren't even reporters in many communities across the country listening to people. And I think that that's an incredibly deep problem that we're facing in society. And of course, there's another element to it, which is that, you know, we don't listen to particular people. We over listen to, you know, very particular groups that tend to be men and tend to be white. And, you know, an essential part of not teaching the histories of Indigenous people, Black people, immigrants in this country is just not listening to them. So I think that that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that when we listen, I think that we will hear, and I think that this actually crosses a pretty broad spectrum, a deep amount of anxiety and fear in society today. Anxiety about the state of the economy, anxiety also, I think, from more conservative elements about you know, cultural change. And interestingly, we've encountered this a lot in the hearings for Congresswoman Deb Haaland. You know, Haaland, the Interior Secretary nominee, has the record as being the member of Congress in the among House freshmen who introduced the most bills with bipartisan support in the 116th Congress. That's a fact. But senators on the Energy and Natural Resource Committee have painted her as a divisive partisan and even gotten kind of Freudian with their comments about her. They've suggested that the first Native American cabinet secretary is somehow going to take away their way of life and you know, damage their lands, which I find to be an incredibly ironic statement of the conservative id. You know, I think whenever you know, whenever the dispossessed finally get our measure of power, there are certain elements of society who always think that we're going to turn around and do to them what their ancestors and governments did to us. And of course, that's not the case if you look at the way Congresswoman Haaland has conducted herself in the hearing as well. So I think that that's another part. And then lastly, you know, sometimes I wonder, as people who, you know, push for and advocate for change, how do we navigate the tension between, you know, the imperative of the changes that we need to make in society and the reality that, you know, and I'll just speak for myself here, like I get really anxious when things in my life are changing. I don't like to move. You know, whenever I have to change jobs, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is going to be really scary. And so how do we on the one hand push for these changes and then also, you know, explain to people that actually in many instances, in fact, in almost every single instance, the changes that we're pushing for are actually about stability. It's about providing people the safety net that they deserve so that, you know, if you're between jobs, you still have healthcare. That, you know, if you, no matter your race, you know, you are guaranteed clean air to drink, clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and safety. You know, I think that's fundamentally a question of security. And I think too often the forces of hate and oppression claim that mantle of safety and security when in fact, they are the ones constantly destabilizing the economy and putting people in jeopardy. And so I think that those three things, you know, listening, recognizing that there's a lot of anxiety in the world right now, and also, you know, being able to speak to that anxiety while being true to our values and the change that we want to see, I think are three things that I think are really important to the path forward for folks like us.
That's great. Thank you so much. Let me see what we got. I think people are shy, but I did have a question. I think that and it sort of speaks to a lot of what Julian was just talking to, and that is, you know, right now we have a very important bill that's sort of ahead of us or in front of us with HR1. And a lot of the disinformation and misinformation that we're seeing that has been impacting the way that we look at, you know, particular subjects or like just completely providing us misinformation on a cabinet secretary position, you know, is because of dark money or just money in politics and ethics, and there's no regulation or control over these things. So I wanted to see if y'all had any thoughts on the comprehensive package that we have ahead of us. What do you think are some of the things that we need to what is the most important priority that you believe is in front of us with tackling like some of the with money in politics that's just been flowing through our campaigns and in our political system, or ethics or voting rights?
So I think that like there are obviously a bunch of legislative priorities that we could look to. HR 1 is one, HR 4 is the other. Someone in the chat mentioned the Voting Rights Act. There's the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which Congressman Schiff had introduced, which is about kind of restoring checks and balances. And I think that when you look historically at countries that have dealt with slides into fascism and authoritarianism and corruption, what you find is that people get into cycles where they're interested in changing who's in office, right? So they vote new people into office and they try to create some of these guardrails. And the guardrails help some. Putting new people into office often doesn't help because they're still operating within the same context. And so I think there's just a need to think bigger about structural changes. And so, for example, one of the largest grassroots organizations right now in the country, Indivisible, has put forth, a legislative priorities list of things that they want to see done: filibuster reform, some of the legislation we're talking about. No constitutional amendments, nothing of that scale and idea. And constitutional amendments are fucking hard. Like, we haven't had one in many years. Like, I get that. But people don't march in the street for marginal change. People want to see big change that affects their lives. And when you look at candidates who've been successful populists who have mass followings, Donald Trump put forth a set of proposals. No one asked if he could do them. Half of them were illegal, and there was a ton of support for them. So when there is deep dissatisfaction, which I think there is both on the left and the right, you need solutions that match the scale of the problem. And I think thinking about how we tinker with our institutions doesn't get people still don't have material relief. People still haven't gotten checks for COVID. Other countries do recurring checks, right? Like, that's still not happening for people right now. Mm-hmm. And so I think when you're thinking about hierarchies of needs, like, it's hard for people to care about their democracy if they can't feed their kids. And so that's what I would offer.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Structural change.
I can just add on to the structural change bit. Part of my role is I work for a think tank called Data for Progress. So I myself am not a huge quant, though I have the good fortune of hanging out with them, and they explain to me how math works. And one of the things that I think sometimes gets overlooked in our conversation about our democratic crisis, small d democratic crisis, is just how significant a structural advantage the conservative party in the United States has. It's a fact that if you do the math, conservatives have about a 5-point what's the word I'm looking for here? If we have to win, so Democrats need to win the popular vote by 5 points to be at about a 50-50 chance of winning the Electoral College. That's what I'm trying to say here. And if you look at the Senate, it's actually even worse, given the way that the Senate disproportionately represents small, rural, tend to be conservative and white states. And in the Senate, it's something between 5 and 7 points that Democrats need to win the popular vote by in order to have a majority in the Senate. And if you just look at that, the depth of that benefit that the Republican Party has in our system, obviously that's not fair. That's not a representative democracy in any sort of traditional sense of the word. And I think that the kinds of changes that we need to be thinking about, I think there's a big conversation about statehood for DC, which is where I live, statehood for some of the territories as well. I think that is really where the conversation is already headed and needs to go when you just look at the structural inequality built into our electoral system.
Great. We do have one question from Charlotte Gibson. On the structural change level, what are your thoughts on whether a national popular vote will help?
I think it helps to the point that Julian made of it removes some of the structural inequalities of whose vote counts more than whose. But, you know, so like Donald Trump won the first election without winning the popular vote, but not by a lot. Like he could have not by, it wasn't, the margins weren't that big. If you look at people in the Senate and the House, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mitch McConnell, they'll still be there with in their districts, in their states with popular vote. Gerrymandering has an impact on all of this, but I guess my point is just there is an appetite for white supremacy in this country. There is an appetite for hatred. There is an appetite for a fear-based politics, and it is not 2% of the country. It is 48% of the country. And that is a real problem. And even if you would say, well, that's not why they voted for him. Well, it didn't stop them from voting for him. So there's still that,
Yeah, I'll just add on to that by saying that one of the fascinating things that's happening to our society politically right now is that on the one hand, if you look at survey data, white Democrats are becoming increasingly progressive on issues of race and culture. I mean, I think that there's another level of that where, white liberals are a complicated species, but we could touch on that in a bit. But at the same time, right, there is this minority, which is, a significant minority, but it's important to remember that it is a minority in this country that, supports sort of revanchist, white nationalist ideas and policies. And the reason why they have disproportionate power is the system that we have. The reason why this minority, which does not speak for a majority of voters in this country, has disproportionate power is because of the Senate. It's because of the way that the Republican Party functions. It's because, in part, actually, of the primary process. And so for all of those reasons, we have a minority of, I think, truthfully, white supremacist people in this country who, are able to essentially terrorize everybody else. And, that is, I don't think, a sustainable way to run a society or a democracy.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question as the sun starts to make me look like a Marvel character. So let me see. The question is from Lauren Rocheleau. She's asking, will eliminating the Electoral College be one way to rebuild democracy? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's the same for whether moving towards a popular vote. I think it's to get rid of the Electoral College presumably means to have a popular vote. So I think it's largely the same conversation.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, I think we're right at time. So I'm very excited that y'all were able to join us for this conversation today and talking about everything from the education system and inequities with access to resources, to structural inequities, to getting people involved in the conversation on changing policy and why that matters. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today, and we are going to turn over the floor to our now president, Christian Nunes, for our award presentation.
So much, Monique, and thank you to the fabulous panelists that we've had. We've had a wonderful day of panels, some great, insightful conversation, some thoughtful, inspiring conversation and discussion. I think a lot of us are fired up right now and just thinking about what we can do next to just really take our activism and organizing to another level. And I think we've also had an opportunity to really think about how we can look at racial justice from different lenses in different ways that maybe we haven't thought about before, and doing it from a transformative way, and also doing it from a very intersectional way, and what that looks like differently from maybe what we thought about before. So we're really excited to come to this end by giving out honor for an exceptional person who deserves this more than many can imagine. It's my distinct honor to present now's Award of Distinction for Intersectional Feminism to a longtime now partner and feminist and racial justice champion, U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Representative Lee is a pioneer in the areas of women's rights, LGBTQIA issues, HIV advocacy, and civil rights. Her activism began at the age as a teen in San Fernando Valley, California, where she worked on the local NAACP chapter to integrate her high school cheerleading squad. She was also an early champion of the Surrey Children, the first African-American woman elected to Congress and the first woman to run for president. She even served as Chisholm's delegate at the 1972 Democratic National Convention. While serving in California State Assembly, Representative Lee authored and passed the first California Violence Against Women Act and served as a member of the California Commission on the Status of Women. In fact, Representative Lee has authored 67 bills and resolutions signed into law by the Republican governor in office at that time. She was an early champion of LGBTQIA+ issues and authored the 1995 California School Hate Crimes Reduction Act. She also created and presided over the California Commission on the Status of African American Males and the California Legislative Black Caucus, while simultaneously working to defeat the punitive three strikes law. For more than 20 years, she has served in the U.S. Congress representing the 13th District of California. She serves on the Powerful Appropriations Committee and is the only African-American woman in the Democratic leadership serving as the co-chair of the Policy and Steering Committee. She also serves as the co-chair of the Pro-Choice Caucus. She's the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and Representative Lee has long advocated for legislation to end poverty. In 2007, she worked on the diverse coalition of members to create the Out of Poverty Caucus. And in 2013, she became the chair of the Democratic Whip Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity. She is also a passionate advocate for criminal justice reform and to end the police brutality. And she so eloquently put it in a statement in 2015, where she said, "Our country has awakened to the fact that to some, the lives of our sons and daughters do not matter. The death of young African Americans are still stinging reminders of our legitimate fears. That statistics are heartbreakingly clear. Our criminal justice system is broken." Representative Lee works every day to fix this system and so many other systems of our society that must be rebuilt to ensure full gender and racial equality for future generations. We encourage you to learn more about her incredible journey, and as you can see, she has been busy for these 30 years. And we encourage you to take up time to learn more about her in an upcoming documentary called Truth to Power, Barbara Lee Speaks to Me, which will be screened at the Pan African Film Festival. You can learn more about this at truthtopower.com. It is for Representative Lee's fierce leadership, her tenacity, her enduring strength, and her great wisdom that now is so proud to honor her with the award of a distinction for intersectional feminism. So we want to thank you all for joining us today for the 2021 Racial Justice Summit. And we want to thank you all for just taking time out of your day today and just being our panelists. And I would be remiss if I did not thank my amazing team, National Action Center staff, interns, our production team, Scott Circle, and our Scott Circle Public Relations firm, and everyone who was a part of this to make this event happen. Our panelists, our speakers, our keynotes, everyone who was part to make this event so successful and amazing. We cannot do with all of you, our membership, our state leaders, our state presidents, our local chapter leaders, our board members and advisory members. We thank you all for your dedication to now being part of our team. We look forward to your continued work and helping us push forward our racial justice commitment. And we thank you. And we know that racial justice is not just limited to the topics we talked about today. We know that we see injustice as a fact of disadvantaged communities, and we've seen this manifest itself in COVID when we look at the distribution of the COVID vaccines, where we see only 5% of Black Americans and only 11% of Latinx communities receive the vaccine distribution. So as we continue, we want to talk to you a little bit more about some programming that we have coming up that we're doing to really talk about the injustices that are taking place in racial inequity. We are so honored to continue our partnership with Black Women's Blueprint, where we talk about the first 100 days of feminist agenda, where we have partnered to address our coalition and our commitment to address our 6 core issues where we tie it to the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. And tomorrow, we will have our next edition of our listening series, where we'll be talking about, on February 25th, the holistic approach to equitable reproductive health care. And we'll expand on many other themes throughout our panel that we heard today throughout the next 100 days. And you can learn more about these at now.org. Through these listening sessions and today's summit today, our racial equity training that we're offering to our staff, our members and board members, and continued. We plan on continuing to focus on our racial equity commitment, racial justice, and focusing on racial equity lens in all the work that we do, the programs we create, and movements and the legislation that we focus on. So we thank you, and we continue to hope that you'll engage with us and be a part of our movement. Thank you for your time today, and you have a great day.